How's it going, everybody? I hope you're all doing well. Okay, well, so in this episode, I thought I'd try to say something about the French existentialist Simone de Beauvoir and a book she wrote, published in 1970, called The Coming of Age. Now, just to be clear, what I'm going to say is not at all comprehensive. That would be very difficult because the book is 650 pages, and both its depth and its scope makes trying to summarize her view very difficult. Okay, so that said, let me start with a broad distinction she makes. So basically, she approaches the topic of aging from two very different points of view. The first one she calls old age seen from without, by which she means how it is others on the outside view the elderly. So this is how older people are viewed from an external standpoint, from the perspective of society as a whole. And the second point of view she explores is how the elderly themselves experience life, from the inside, so to speak, or as she calls it, from the position of being in the world. So basically, this is a first-person perspective. It's a perspective that views the elderly as subjects and not as the objects of knowledge they appear from the external standpoint. Okay, so now that we've established these two distinctions or approaches, let's explore each of them in turn. So let's start with how it is de Beauvoir thinks old age is viewed from the point of view of society at large. Well, basically, what society sees when it looks at the elderly is this. It's what de Beauvoir calls otherness, or the other. Now, what this is both a form of objectification and a form of marginalization. In other words, society objectifies and alienates older people, reducing them to a stereotype and not as real subjects with a continuing life. Actually, in this way, there's a striking parallel here with what de Beauvoir says about how it is women are perceived in her older seminal work, The Second Sex. There she famously argues that woman is the other, which is to say that she's defined not as primary and autonomous like the man is, but as secondary or derivative, and as an object, not as a subject. It's for this reason, among several others, that The Second Sex and this book, The Coming of Age, have been regarded by some commentators as two works that are like twin sisters. But anyway, so back to The Coming of Age. So the point about society seeing the elderly as the other is that this external gaze that society imposes on them, it fixes older people. It reduces them to some kind of label, often a dehumanizing one. You know, like older people are a burden, or they're past their prime, or they're no longer useful, and so on. Okay, well, now given that old age is so tied up with the perception of the wider culture, de Beauvoir wants to say that there is a real sense in which old age is therefore, to a certain degree, a social construction. As she herself says, old age is not solely a biological fact, but it's also a cultural fact. So for her, without diminishing physiological facts about age, of course, it's actually often cultural norms or values that define what age is for her. Well, actually, now's a good time to say something about the other approach that she takes towards aging, namely the first-person perspective I mentioned. So what she says is that from the inside, subjectively speaking, aging feels very different from how it's experienced through the eyes of others. That is, the person getting older often feels vital and ageless, at least in their consciousness. And they still live in a world with aims and with projects. Okay, but given this, there's this tension now. There's this tension between how an elderly person feels on the inside and the outer image imposed on them by society. And so what happens is that older people, at least initially, often feel estranged from themselves in the sense that their true self and their appearance or perception don't quite match. Well, again, this is how society's perspective on older people can, in a way, be oppressive. It's oppressive in the sense that the older person is compelled to accept the label they are given by others, even though they may not feel it themselves. And once more, this is because, to use de Beauvoir's language, we experience our age in our being for others, or basically through people's perceptions of ourselves. We submit to their point of view. We submit to their judgmental gazes. Okay, but ultimately, that's not the whole story, actually. Because here's the thing. There is also the inevitable fact that at some point there just is decline in age. And that can be a revelation that's both recognized from the outside and from the first person perspective. In other words, we can become aware of our aging, and often that happens all of a sudden, by the sorts of unexpected reactions that we get from others. Like for de Beauvoir, it was when people said that she reminded them of their mother. But we can also become aware of it by sensing a fundamental transformation in our own lived bodies. And for de Beauvoir, when we're finally hit with this crisis, this decline in old age, this acknowledgement of old age, it's all about how we handle it that matters. It's about how we deal with this identification crisis of old age. Okay, so for her, there are inauthentic and there are authentic ways of doing this, of dealing with old age. Now, inauthentic ways, those would largely involve a denial of old age, or at least an unwillingness to move forward. So one strategy, of course, is to fixate on the past, and so to preserve our youth by clinging to and by identifying with our memories. By always looking back, we keep alive the person we used to be, right? Now, for de Beauvoir, this is inauthentic because it ossifies our being into something it used to be, and it doesn't acknowledge that we are still dynamic and still have a future. Okay, well, another very common strategy, but again, an inauthentic one, is to cover up old age through cosmetics and through surgery. But to quote de Beauvoir herself, dyes and peelings and plastic surgery can never do more than prolong her dying youth. Not only is this trying to solidify ourselves in this youthful look, which again is a betrayal of the future, but it's also to capitulate to and to become complicit with this wider culture of ageism that claims that youth is good and that getting older is bad and something to be shameful about, and so something to escape from. But here's the thing, the sad truth is that it's not the aged who are subhuman or undignified. No, it's all the rest of society who are. And that's because in their repulsion towards the elderly, they're doing nothing but fleeing their own humanity. Anyway, so what is it to approach old age authentically then? Well, first of all, it's to accept the cold, hard truth that getting old is just a fact of our condition. And to accept that it's not always glorious. Things like boredom and melancholy and loneliness can be very real. And the body can be a site of betrayal. But then it's not to resort to, in de Beauvoir's own words, it's not to resort to becoming an absurd parody of our past lives. No, It's to get up and to face forward. It's to go on pursuing meaningful ends and to devote ourselves to others and to causes. And here, de Beauvoir reminds us of something very, very important, I think. And it's that for the elderly, the future is not as closed as it seems. Now you might think, well, wait a sec, how is that? I mean, they're closer to death, and so their horizon must be limited, right? But no, says de Beauvoir. And that's because for her, life is not simply a march toward an ending where in that final moment our future ultimately collapses. No, each of our individual actions and our larger projects, they all ripple forward into future lives and into larger communities. So on this view, the individual's existence and their possibilities don't close down in old age, but rather they loop into the continuous existence of others. Our contributions live on in the lives of the next generation. So what it means to be authentic in old age is to acknowledge that the future is always meaningful, even if it's not personally accessible. And again, that's because we all shape the future, even after our death. Bye for now.